Years back, I made a late-night stop at a local Walmart on my way home from a friend's house. It was in a quiet area, not a lot of people out and about at nearly 1 a.m. I've lived around there for years and never run into any truly criminal elements there, so I felt safe going to the store alone as a woman in my early 20s. I made eye contact with a teenage girl the second I walked in the door. She was parked on a bench by the restrooms, hugging a backpack and small purse, checking her phone with a rather desperate expression on her face. When she looked at me, I could tell that she was on the verge of panicking. After a brief second of staring at me, she went back to checking her phone and making phone calls. At the other end of the bench was a white-haired man in jeans and a t-shirt. If I had to guess, he was probably in his late 50s or early 60s. Altogether, nothing appeared off about him. But what struck me was the fact that he never looked up as I passed. Instead, his eyes were absolutely glued to the teenage girl next to him. Not in a passive way, but like he was sizing her up for something. She was perched on the edge of the bench, angling herself away from his gaze and leaning away from him. Her body language screamed that she wanted nothing to do with him. Something about him set off warning bells in my head as I went about grabbing the items I had stopped for. I'm normally the type of person that mills about stores aimlessly, making a point to wander each aisle just to see what's for sale. That night, however, I felt a pressing need to get in and out of the store as quickly as possible, and something in the back of my head told me to keep an eye on the man on the front bench. I moved my knife from my purse to the front pocket of my jeans, where it would be easily accessible. That's how uneasy I felt being in the same building as this man. As I purchased my items, I watched the pair on the front bench. The man had moved halfway across the space between them and was trying to chat with the young woman. She was shaking her head and offering one-word answers, looking like a rabbit about to bolt. As I walked past them again to leave with my purchases, she stopped me and asked if I was headed anywhere close to my old hometown. Apparently, she'd been on her way home from a trip with friends, and they had made a stop to grab drinks and use the restroom. She'd gotten separated from the group, and they left her at the store. The store was about a 30-minute drive from my old hometown, and I knew that to get home, she'd have to walk several hours along unlit stretches of rural highway. The man sitting next to her continued to leer at her, but refused to look my way. While I would normally have told the girl that I was headed the opposite direction, something in the back of my head told me not to leave her alone with the man. I agreed to take her home, and she thanked me profusely and offered gas money and a cigarette. I refused both and took her home, the logical part of my brain reasoning that the girl weighed maybe 100 pounds and was a full head shorter than I was, so if it came down to it, I could fight her off. The girl mentioned her address, and I knew exactly where she was talking about. It was an old, quiet neighborhood where I used to play Little League baseball down the street and swim in the pool a few blocks away. During the drive, she told me that she'd just moved to the area with her mom and younger sisters from a larger city several hours south. She'd taken off with a few of her old friends for the weekend, and her mom hadn't expected her back until the following day, so she'd silenced her phone for the night and hadn't picked up when the girl tried to call. We arrived at our destination, and the girl gave me a handshake and thanked me repeatedly, asking if there was anything she could do to repay me. I told her, "Yeah, do me a favor, get better friends." Looking back, I have no idea what about the man creeped me out so much, but something about him and the way he was staring at that girl got my hackles up. I had thought in passing that he might have been waiting for someone else in the store, perhaps someone using the nearby restroom, but upon checking out it struck me that I hadn't seen any other customers there, so he really had no reason to be waiting on that bench. I was still living with my parents at the time, so when I got home, I woke my mom up and told her what happened. She hesitated, and I could see that she didn't like the idea of me giving a stranger a ride home. But in the end, she agreed that something had prompted me to take action, and that I might have saved that young girl from being harassed, or worse. When my son was a baby, my mother-in-law would watch him for us while we worked. Because my shift started at 6 a.m., I would pack the baby up early to drive him to Mill's house and turn around and go right to work. It was about 1.5 miles from Mill's house, and I would travel the main road. One particular morning, I drove, traveling south, approximately 5:15 a.m., to drop the baby off at my Mills. It was mid-October, and the sun wasn't quite up yet. Near the side of the road on the opposite side, I noticed an older model black vehicle sitting with no driver or passenger. In retrospect, it stuck out because it wasn't quite parked at the side of the road, but it wasn't sticking out to block traffic either. It legit looked stranded. I dropped the baby off with MIL and left to go to work, using the same main road, passing the same area, seeing the same car, but now it's on my side of the road because I'm traveling north. I slowed down because I suddenly noticed a man standing near the front bumper of the car. He was wearing a white button-down shirt, black pants, and was holding his hands up over his head. In one hand, he was jingling a key ring with keys on it. In the other hand, it looked to be a wallet. Being very young and altruistic, I instantly felt bad for this man, because clearly he had broken down at the side of the road with no help. To put this in perspective, back then, not everyone had cell phones. Altruistic me slows down as I got closer, and the man's face brightened up, making me feel even better for thinking about being a good person for helping him. Again, clearly, he was a businessman who had broken down on the side of the road, likely late for work, and there I am to help. Right? He approaches my car and he says to me, "You've answered my prayers. Could you just take me about 1 mile up the road?" I said, "Sure, of course. Did your car break down?" He replied with, "Good thing that's not my car." Stupid me then quickly reasoned that it must be his wife's car, and he was just keeping his good humor with such a horrible morning. I motioned for him to get into my car, and I told him to put his seatbelt on. He buckles his seatbelt, and I proceed to put the car in drive and ask him if I'm dropping him off at work, or where was he going because I wanted to make small talk with my passenger. Within a moment of pulling away from the car, he leans toward me and says, "So, do you want to know how many felonies I have?" My heart sunk for a quick second, and I laughed, hoping he would be laughing with me. Silence. So I glanced over at him, while still trying to drive and keep my composure, and he's starting at me with the deadpan stare and a smirk on his face. I instantly became panicked and angry, remembering all of the useless self-defense tips I'd learned, realizing that at this point in time, they would do me no good. I was in a vehicle with a stranger that I willingly let into my car. My hands got tight on the steering wheel, and before I could get another thought through my head, he said to me, "Why did you think that was my car on the side of the road? I'm not allowed to have a license, let alone a car, you dizzy little girl." And he was laughing, the most horrid laugh I'd ever heard. I slammed the brakes on as soon as he called me a dizzy little girl. There was barely any traffic, although I was hoping a car would have rear-ended me to signal police help anything. From the pit of my soul, I screamed, "Get the fuck out of my car, you motherfucker, or I'll stab you." I didn't have a knife, and I don't know why I said what I said, but he unbuckled his seatbelt and dashed out of my car. I was so shaken and peeled off as fast as I could. I went straight to work and shared the morning's events with my coworkers. I'm shaking right now typing this out. I could imagine the mess I was by the time I got to work. I was crying a lot. It was so horrific. After my shift, I went back the same road so I could pick the baby up from Mill's house, and that car was still there in the same spot. I pulled into the gas station and asked the cashier if she knew who that black car belonged to, and she said she had no clue. It had been there the day before, but someone must have taken the white rag off of it, or it blew away, because it was gone now. A white rag tied to a side view mirror or car door handle means there was a mechanical issue, and please don't give me a ticket signal. I don't know if this is a national trick for motorists, but that's what people do where I'm from. I couldn't tell the cashier what happened that morning, due to pure embarrassment. So I went to pick my baby up from my MIL's house and went home. I didn't take that main road again for a very long time. This story took place when I was 23 years old, close to 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit. One morning, before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years my senior, but during this particular fight, he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, then why don't you go back to the fucking Bronx?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and flew out of the house. Unfortunately, I am an impulsive ass and didn't think to grab my cell phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option was to walk. I don't think at the time that I intended to walk back to the Bronx, as I was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just needed to go for an angry, dramatic walk. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me, as I had only lived there a few months at that point, and we really didn't go out a lot. I banked left and just walked and walked where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road, with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I saw my then boyfriend driving by on his way to work, and he sped up as he drove past me, evidently still angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow, and I was losing momentum. I passed by a VFW, where a nondescript pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I had passed it that I even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me, "Hey honey, do you need help?" My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept this stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal, older white guy. Gray hair, greenish blue eyes, just average. I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" and cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. He answered, "I'm a good guy. I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy." I ignored the bells going off in my head and got in the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my destination. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask her where the fuck I was going. I called her 3 times, and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing pajamas. I explained I was originally from the Bronx and that I had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused and said, "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?" I chuckled nervously and said, "Oh, no thanks though." He responded, "Well, I just figured since you said you were from the Bronx," and trailed off. Realizing at that point that I was almost definitely in deep shit, I muttered, "Oh, sure." He eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering, Sure, she says." I started to panic big time, but knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could land in if I leapt out of the truck to no avail. The houses were so few and far in between, I became certain this would be how I met my demise. It was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's full name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband and how they used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving at the promised land. I sheepishly asked his name. "Steve," he said, then asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a bullshit thank you, and ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed through the front door and locked it behind me. I immediately started crying and running through the house trying to find my friend's mom. I had awoken her from a sound sleep, but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything. The fight, the fleeing, the weird guy and his sexual proposition. And she listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless again, and that if I needed her to call her. She told me she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's later that same day and got really stoned to try to forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a dangerous person who her husband had cut off communication with years ago. The last he had heard about Steve was that he had been arrested for sexual assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road, and no one would even know where to look for me. Not to mention, I might not have even been found until the snow thawed out.